About a week ago, I was able to get my hands on the all-new 2022 Honda Civic for the first time down in Orange County, California. Since then, I have driven this back home, a road trip of about 400 miles, and I've spent a week behind the wheel. So let's dive through the numbers, take a look around the outside, and then we'll talk about how this compares with the competition. This new Civic is available only as a sedan at the beginning. There will be a hatchback or a sportback, whatever you want to call it, coming a little bit later, but no two-door version is happening in this generation. You should also know that Honda is really targeting a more premium audience with this Civic. It starts at $21,700, and there are a decent number of the competition that will start under $20,000. Be sure and let me know what you think about the styling of the new Civic down there in the comment section. Some people have found this design boring, some people have found it a little bit luxury car-like. I could definitely see that if they just replaced the Honda logo with an Acura logo, this wouldn't necessarily look out of place in the modern Acura lineup. Perhaps just a little bit of a grille tweak right there. We get full LED headlights in all trims, LED turn signals right up there, and optional LED fog lights at the bottom. This model is the top-end touring trim, so we also have parking sensors front and rear. Even though Honda has been going after a more premium audience for a while, and again, that's definitely obvious with this 2022 Civic, it doesn't seem to affect their sales. A full fourth of the models sold in the compact sedan segment are either Corollas or Civics. They both command about a quarter of the share, and the other 6 sedans split the remaining half of this segment. At 184 inches, the new Civic sedan is now on the long side of the segment. Honda has also tweaked the proportions a little bit, giving this a longer hood profile, just like we've seen in some modern Acuras. It really gives this, again, a more elegant look than some of the competition. We have LED turn signals nicely integrated into the side view mirrors, and when the hatch comes out a little bit later this year, you'll notice that they're really going for sort of a BMW Grand Coupe or an Audi hatchback look, because it has a very similar profile to the sedan. In fact, it has the same front doors and back doors and roofline as the sedan. It just turns into a liftback or a sportback right back here. So it's not going to be a shortened station wagon or a really boxy hatch like we find in the Volkswagen Golf. One thing that surprised me about the new Civic is that even though Honda is targeting a more premium audience, perhaps like Mazda with their new Mazda 3, we don't have full LED taillights. Instead, these are combination lamps, so the turn signal and the backup lights are incandescent, the brake lights and the parking lights are LEDs. We also don't have any visible exhaust tips at the bottom in the sedan. If you get the hatch, then you do have 2 well-integrated exhaust tips. Again, very Audi-like in that particular design. This model also has the rear parking sensors. Honda has long had a serious dedication to safety, and that has led them to make a ton of driver assistance technologies standard on nearly every vehicle in the Honda lineup. Features like radar adaptive cruise control and lane keeping assistance, features that may be optional on a decent number of the competition, especially competitors that start less expensive than the Honda Civic. For 2022, this gets the latest generation of Honda sensing. That includes radar adaptive cruise control, their aggressive lane keeping system, auto high beams, roadside information, traffic jam assist, and then optional, we now have blind spot monitoring. That's a bit different than we've seen before in the Civic. Instead of blind spot monitoring like we traditionally see, or we now see in this model, Honda had used a camera-based system they called Lane Watch. That system is gone, now replaced by a traditional blind spot monitoring system. Cross-traffic detection is also optional, as are rear parking sensors, autonomous emergency braking in low-speed maneuvers. We have the front and rear parking sensors, so speeds between 1 and 6 miles an hour. This will try and help keep you from hitting that wall in the parking garage or hitting a pot in your driveway. We also have rain-sensing wipers on this model. The base engine for 2022 is a 2-liter 4-cylinder model. It produces 158 horsepower and 138 pound-feet of torque. Really cementing the Civic's premium position in this segment is the engine that I'm driving today. It's a 1.5-liter turbo, and this is the one that I suspect you will find in most Civics on the dealer lot. You'll find this in EX and Touring trims. This produces 180 horsepower and 177 pound-feet of torque. That's significantly more power and more torque than we find in most of the competition. Now, there are sport entries in this segment, like the Elantra N-Line and the Elantra N. This engine does not compete with them. That will be the upcoming Civic Si and potentially a Civic Type R at some point in the future. Honda has not been horribly specific about exactly which performance variants we'll see later and which engines we'll find in the sedan or in the hatchback, but you can bet that at the very least a Civic Si sedan is coming. Another interesting twist with the 1.5-liter turbo is that this gives you the best fuel economy in the Civic. Fuel economy will range between 33 and 36 miles per gallon. Both engines are mated to a continuously variable automatic transmission, but even though we have more power and more torque out of the 1.5, you get 1 mile per gallon better than the 2.0. When you look at the fuel economy charts, you'll notice that there are two different fuel economy numbers listed for each engine. Tires are the reason. 215 with tires are standard on both the 2-liter and the 1.5-liter turbo, and 235 with tires are available with each engine choice. The Touring and the Sport trim get the wider tires, so fuel economy drops by 1 mpg. It's worth noting that 235 with tires are pretty wide for the compact sedan segment. Even vehicles that have a more sporty bent than this may not necessarily have 225s on them, so you can expect even wider tires on potential SI or Type R trims. Road tripping the Civic home gave me 6 uninterrupted hours to experience the driver's seat, and I did find one major flaw. We don't have adjustable lumbar support at all for the driver, which seems like a really odd omission even in the top-end Touring trim that I'm driving. We do have a power passenger seat, but it doesn't have the same range of motion as the driver's seat. Personally, I would have preferred a manual passenger seat and 2-way or 4-way lumbar for the driver, because this left me to one of my old tricks, which was to just put the instruction manual for the vehicle right back there to give me additional lumbar support. We do have a manual tilt telescopic steering column, however, with a large range of motion. Jumping into the back seat, we find class-leading legroom. With this front seat adjusted for me at 6 feet tall, you can see I have about 6 or 7 inches of legroom left. This is the kind of compact sedan where you would have absolutely no problem at all putting a rear-facing child seat. If I scoot over to the right side, the footwell appears to be a little bit cramped. It's a little bit difficult to get my feet in and out here, but legroom is still pretty generous. I have about 2 inches with this front seat all the way back in its tracks. Another odd omission in here, no rear seat air vents. And again, keep in mind that I am driving the top-end Touring trim. Another thing that you should keep in mind is that the top 2 trims of the Civic are the only ones that get 60/40 folding rear seat backs, and the rear armrest with cup holders is an optional feature as well. If you get the lower end trims of the Civic, the rear seats still fold, but it's a 100% folding unit, and that's not as cargo practical as the 60/40. The other thing you should know is that although legroom is definitely enormous, headroom is a little bit more limited than you might suspect. We have 37.1 inches of headroom back here, which means I can't really put my head back there towards the headrest. However, due to the shape of the ceiling, if I'm sitting in a more natural position like this, I have about ½ an inch of headroom left. So for most people, this should be just fine, but if you do want to have a more relaxed experience, say you're road tripping with 4 people and that person might want to use the headrest, keep in mind that's going to be a little bit tricky in here. Also, the hatchback has basically the same kind of interior room because the majority of the vehicle from this point forward does not change with the hatch. The doors are the same, the ceiling profile is roughly the same as well. Although the rear seat passengers don't get air vents, they do get 2 USB charge-only ports in the center console. Behind the trunk lid, we find 14.8 cubic feet of cargo space. That's almost equal to the Toyota Camry. The Camry has 15.1 in most trims. So this is definitely a large and accommodating cargo area. And most importantly, it's pretty deep, so you can actually put some 22-inch roller bags just barely in this position. This is the largest size that you can carry on to a domestic flight, and you can still close the trunk lid. Thanks to the generous size of this cargo area, I was able to get 5 24-inch roller bags in here. We do have a spare tire under the load floor. It's a temporary spare, and I suspect that in some models, a full-size spare tire might fit, although not the trim that I'm driving here. The releases for the rear seat backs are right back here in the cargo area. In the Alex & Auto's exclusive Trunk Comfort Index, I'm going to give this cargo area 9 out of 10 points. It does lose just a little bit because the 60/40 folding seats are not standard, they are optional, but we do have a large amount of cargo space and a little handle to help close the trunk lid. One thing that surprised me is that the emergency release for the trunk is a little bit different than normal. It's right here on the top of the trunk lid rather than down there towards the latch. You push it to the side to open the trunk. As we look around the interior, keep in mind that we are in the top-end Touring trim. This module right here above the rear view mirror is for the camera and some of the other related systems for the safety systems. We have the controls for the moonroof right there, a sunglass holder, a pretty standard-sized moonroof just over the driver and front passengers' heads. We then have height-adjustable shoulder belts and 2-way adjustable headrests for the driver and front passenger. Since I'm driving the top-end Touring trim, we have leather upholstery with perforations, but these seats are not ventilated like we do find in some options in this segment. They are just heated. We have a decent percentage of soft-touch materials moving over to the front doors. Soft-touch armrest right there, soft-touch upper section of the door, but the section right there around that handle is actually a hard plastic. Since we're in the Touring trim, we have leather upholstery with perforations in the seat back and seat bottom cushion, but these seats are not ventilated, they are just heated. You will find ventilated seats in some of the competition. Moving over to the front doors, we have a reasonable percentage of soft touch material. We have a soft touch armrest, soft touch upper section of the door, but the insert right there around that door handle and that shiny black piece of trim, that's a hard plastic. Moving over to the dashboard, we have a very unique dash design, one that I've been a little bit conflicted about because I love the look here. We have two air vents in the center, one air vent over there on the passenger side, and then this large honeycomb strip that runs from one side to the other. This does not contain an air vent in the middle section. You can see that it's integrated into the air vents right here in the middle and then over there on the passenger side, but beyond this point, all the way up until that air vent right over there on that side, this is just a styling element, and it is open to some plastic sections behind to give it a bit of depth, but it does mean that it might be a little bit more difficult to clean in the future. Let me know what you think about that. Obviously, of course, I haven't had any opportunity to clean that, but I do live in a fairly dusty area. I live down a gravel road, and that is something that really comes to mind for me at least. Below that, we have a pretty decently sized bin-style glove compartment. I was not able to fit a tablet computer inside, but again, I was able to squeeze my lumbar support in there. In the dashboard, we have two different infotainment systems depending on the trim that you get. There's a 7-inch or a 9-inch touchscreen. You'll find this one only in the very top end trim of Civic. There are two physical buttons over here, and then we have a toggle for track forward, backward, and a volume knob. This features wireless Apple CarPlay, but you can use the USB connection if you'd rather do that. That's a really nice touch, and not every system that supports wireless CarPlay also supports a USB connection. Those two air vents are right there, the engine start-stop button, the controls for the optional dual-zone automatic climate control. This is also where we find the buttons for the heated seats. It does look like they could put a ventilated seat button right there if they wanted to, but again, no ventilated seats in this model. Below that, we have two USB ports. One is an input for the system, one is a charge-only port. We then have the Qi wireless charging mat. You can see that I can't quite fit a larger smartphone like that inside when the USB cable is connected to it, but it would fit just on the charge mat by itself. The shifter is a pretty traditional console design, no low mode or sport mode right there on the shifter, because we do have a drive mode selector right here, which allows us to choose sport mode, normal mode, or econ. We then have a button to disable the auto start-stop system, the electric parking brake, auto brake hold, two big cup holders right there, and we get a slightly revised Honda key. This looks very similar to other Honda keys. You can see that they've rounded the edges off and made it feel a little bit more premium. Between the front seats, we have a padded center armrest that opens to reveal a storage compartment that is definitely different than what we found in the Civic before. This whole console is a lot more traditional than the previous generation Civic, and as a result, certainly more comfortable to put your arm on. This is a really thickly padded center armrest, and this little divider can be put into two different positions. There are two different LCD instrument clusters. There's a 7-inch display in the lower end trims, and then the top end trim gets this just over 10-inch display. You can see that everything except for the engine temperature and the fuel level is on the LCD. This is 10.2 inches. Another really interesting touch is right here in the center. You'll see the little car icon shows us when the brake lights are on, and it shows you when the turn signals are on too. That's kind of a cool little touch. So if you're driving with the radar adaptive cruise control on and you're wondering if the brakes are being activated, you can actually tell right there on that screen. If you want to know more about this instrument cluster, be sure and check out my first look video on the Civic. I go into that in greater detail. It is highly configurable. It has two basic looks. We then have a new 3-spoke steering wheel, paddle shifters on the back depending on the trim that you get. Infotainment buttons over here on the left side. This scroll wheel controls the left side of that multifunction LCD. This scroll wheel controls the right side. We then have the controls for the radar adaptive cruise control system and the lane keeping assistance system over here on the right side. The weirdest thing about the Civic is the performance. Weird because nobody else is trying to do what Honda is doing. This model goes 0 to 60 in 6.6 seconds. And the 1.5-liter turbo engine is a very popular engine in the Civic. So likely depending on where you are in the country, if you go to your Honda dealer, the majority of the Civics on dealer lots could be this 1.5-liter turbo. And this is significantly faster at 6.6 seconds, 0 to 60, than any version of the Toyota Corolla, or the vast majority of Hyundai Elantras, or Kia Fortes, etc. And remember that the faster versions of the Elantra are not competitors to this 1.5-liter turbo. They're designed to compete against the Civic Si, which is going to be the next level of performance, or the Civic Type R if we're talking about the Golf R, etc. Honda also puts wider tires on the Civic than the vast majority of the competition. Again, 235 width tires on this model. So not only is this Civic pretty quick, it also handles incredibly well. And it has a really, really well sorted suspension, especially the independent rear suspension. That's very different than we find in the Mazda 3. The Mazda 3 has, I think, better steering feel than this, but the suspension is just not as sorted, especially the rear suspension. In the Mazda 3, over broken pavement in the corners, the rear suspension can get really upset and unsettled, and you kind of feel like it's skipping over the pavement. That does not happen in this Civic. You can drive this much harder than the Mazda 3. We have not only better grip, but we have better suspension dynamics as well. Everything about the Civic just demands to be driven harder than the Corolla or the Elantra or the Forte or even the Jetta. And the Jetta has a really solid feel to it too. It has a really Germanic feel, but it's simply better in the Civic. And again, remember, there's going to be a Civic Si and a Civic Type R at some point in the future. So this is simply where performance starts in the Civic lineup. Thanks to the wide tires on this model, I was able to stop from 60 miles an hour back to 0 in 118 feet. That is definitely short for a mainstream compact sedan, and it could be even shorter if you put grippier tires on it. These are 235 with tires, but they're just regular all-season tires. If you were to put summer tires on, you would stop a little bit quicker, and you'd also handle even better. But you don't need summer tires to make the most out of the Civic, because this is just a ton of fun to drive as it is. This is quite simply the best handling model in this segment outside the performance entries. So if you're looking for the best handling compact sedan outside an Elantra N line or an Elantra N or a Civic Si or a Civic Type R, that is going to be the regular old Civic in the top end touring trim or the sport trim with the 2-liter engine. That's another interesting twist with the Civic, is that you don't have to get the touring trim to get the wider tires. You'll find that on the sport model as well. That also gets the paddle shifters on the CVT. Now, if you want a manual transmission, you're going to have to get the Civic hatch, because that will offer a manual and the sedan is CVT only. Out on a rougher road like the gravel road that I'm on now, I'm going to give the ride quality a B. You will certainly find some slightly softer models in this segment, mainly base entries, because they tend to have smaller wheels, taller profile tires, etc., and that is going to give a smoother ride. But I think that Honda has struck exactly the right balance with the ride quality and handling, because the Civic is a ton of fun to drive, and it's still very daily driver livable as far as the ride quality goes. But if you're after something that has an even smoother highway ride, you will certainly find that in some of the competition. The Elantra has a really well-polished ride in this latest generation. In my cabin noise test at 50 miles an hour, I measured 72 decibels in this cabin. This appears to be a little bit quieter than the outgoing Civic, but like most compact sedans, things are definitely a little bit louder in here than in something like an Accord or a Camry. Part of that is likely the tires. If you have wider tires, you're going to get a little bit more tire noise, a little bit more road noise, and more of that's going to come into the cabin. So I wouldn't be surprised if you got the EX or the base version of the Civic if the cabin noise was a little bit lower. When it comes to fuel economy, I'm certainly going to give this model an A. The 1.5-liter turbo in regular sedate driving will get better fuel economy than the 2-liter engine, but obviously if you're driving them hard, the 1.5-liter turbo will get lower fuel economy. In order to make more power, you simply have to burn more fuel. There's no way around that. But on a comparable long highway journey, the 1.5-liter turbo will end up giving you better fuel economy. Over my journey from Southern California to Northern California, going up and over a number of mountain passes, I averaged 39 miles per gallon, which is an excellent fuel economy score for this vehicle. Remember, on some portions of that journey on US 101, the speed limit is 70 miles an hour. Over a week and about 600 miles of mixed driving, I've been averaging 36 miles per gallon in this model, which is just a hair above the EPA score. If you want to get better fuel economy in your next compact sedan and you don't want a Civic, you're probably going to need to get a hybrid, because those are really going to be the only models that will get over 40 mpg. But they're not going to be nearly as much fun as this Civic. Bottom lining the Civic out on the road at the moment is quite easy. This is quite simply the most dynamic compact sedan you can buy in America outside the performance models. Obviously, the Elantra N line, the Elantra N, any of those performance varieties, the Jetta GLI, etc., they're going to be better in terms of handling numbers, in terms of handling feel, etc., than this, stopping distance, that sort of thing. But remember that that is not where Honda is trying to compete, because this will range between $21,700 and about $28,000. We'll get into that in just a little bit. This is a much less expensive vehicle than those performance options, because the performance trim of the Civic hasn't happened yet. As you might expect, the redesigned Civic comes with a redesigned price list. The base model for $21,700 is the LX trim, giving you standard Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. $23,100 buys you the Sport trim. That's where we get the paddle shifters, leather steering wheel, 235 with tires, but you get all of that on the base engine, the naturally aspirated one. If you want the turbo, that's $24,700 starting for the EX trim. That swaps you back to the narrower tires, back to 215s. We get cloth seats, but they're heated, and you get a lot of standard equipment that we don't find on the Sport trim, even though we also get that turbocharged engine. So I think that the EX model is probably the best value in the Civic lineup. That's where we find blind spot monitoring, rear cup holders, 2-zone climate control, a 60/40 folding rear seat. The other two trims have a 100% folding rear seat, which is not nearly as practical. You also get a moonroof and variable intermittent wipers. Unlike some of Honda's other products, there's no EXL trim where you get leather. You have to step up into the touring model, and that's going to be the one that gives you leather, goes back to the 235 with tires. It gets rear cross-traffic detection, which is oddly enough separated from blind spot monitoring. I'm not quite sure why, since they use the same sensor. We also get premium audio, wireless Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. This is the only one that will get that particular feature. It's also the only one that gets the 9-inch touchscreen infotainment system, the 10.2-inch instrument cluster. It's the only model with navigation software as well. I think that's also a little bit odd. Parking sensors are on that model, and of course the paddle shifters return. If the way that Honda has arranged some of these options makes you scratch your head, don't worry, you're not alone, but you should also not wait for 2023 because it's unlikely that Honda will do any rearranging of options. That's just something that Honda doesn't seem to do. With that out of the way, let's dive into the closest competitor, the bestseller in this segment, the Toyota Corolla. This is the bestseller by just about a hair. The Corolla and the Civic are the 1,000-pound gorilla in the room. They are by far the best sellers. And that's quite logical because there has long been a rivalry between Corolla and Civic, but as the years have gone on, they've gone in slightly different directions. The Corolla is definitely more affordable. It starts at $20,075 for 2022. That's a decent amount less than the Civic, but we don't find all the same kind of feature content in that Corolla. With the Corolla, Toyota is still laser focused on the classic Toyota values of making an easy-to-live-with cabin, comfortable, affordable, and incredibly reliable. Reliability is definitely the Corolla's strong suit, especially when you take a look at some of those long-term reliability and dependability metrics. On the downside, the Corolla is less powerful. It's not quite as much fun to drive. It doesn't feel as modern or as luxurious or quite as grown-up, I guess you'd say, as the Civic. Depending on how you have your Corolla configured, it may also be just about as expensive as the Civic. The top-end Apex trim is $28,360. It has considerably less power than the turbocharged engine that we find in the top-end Civic model. And as you might expect from the newest entry in this segment, you'll find more gadgets, more gizmos, more legroom, etc. inside the Civic than you will in the Corolla. At least for me, bottom lining the Civic and the Corolla is pretty easy. If you're looking to buy a compact sedan and drive it for 200 or 300,000 miles and you want the highest reliability and highest dependability, that's going to be in the Corolla. If you want to drive 200,000 miles and you're willing to spend a bit more on long-term repairs and maintenance, but have a lot more fun in the process, that would be the Honda Civic. Next up, we have the Nissan Sentra, which is definitely focused on value. It has a really low sticker price of $19,460, a lot of standard equipment in that model. It doesn't get nearly as high as the Civic or the Corolla in terms of its price tag. $24,665 is as high as you can get with the two-tone paint option, all the interior options, and the SR trim. Although I would say the Sentra is a little bit less fun to drive than the Civic, it's actually a little bit more fun to drive than the Corolla, and Nissan has done a really good job making it fun to drive and inexpensive at the same time. I think they've also done a good job designing the interior. Although most of the trims seem to get a black interior, if you can get one of the lighter interiors in the Sentra, it really does look like a mini Altima inside and on the outside. I think generally speaking, it's a really good look. The Sentra is also a really, really good deal because not only does it have a low sticker price, it's also going to have more cash on the hood at the Nissan dealer than you'll find either on the Corolla or on the Civic. In the real world, that top-end SR trim could be $1,000 to $2,000 off, depending on where exactly you live in the United States. That would mean that the top-end trim of that Sentra could end up being about the same price as a base model Civic. And you get more equipment on the inside, you get a more fun vehicle than that base Civic, and I think it actually looks pretty good as well. It does a really good job trying to straddle the line between looking clean and modern, but also looking a little bit aggressive. I like the front-end design, and Nissan has done a good job adapting it to the Sentra. On the other hand, there is no version of the Sentra that will compete with the top-end versions of the Civic in terms of acceleration, or certainly in terms of handling, and we're not even talking about the Civic Si yet. We're just talking about the regular turbocharged model. Now let's move on to what I think is the toughest competition, the Elantra and the Kia Forte. The Hyundai-Kia conglomerate offers two options in this segment. Combined, they sell almost as many as the Civic. When it comes right down to it, most of the difference between the Elantra and the Forte is styling. They use basically the same infotainment software, the same engines and transmissions, etc. Elantra pricing is so aggressive that honestly the SEL trim with the convenience package is realistically the competitor to the base version of the Civic. According to MSRP, that should be about $300 more, but likely you're going to be paying about the same amount for that vehicle. $22,000 is what Hyundai says the MSRP is. For that price, you get a full LCD instrument cluster, blind spot monitoring, cross-traffic detection, wireless charging for your smartphone, a leather steering wheel, and a few other gadgets that you'd have to step way up the ladder in the Civic lineup to get. In addition to that, the upper-end trims of the Elantra and the Kia Forte are very well priced. And to get the same level of equipment on the Hyundai versus the Honda, you will certainly be paying less for the Hyundai, and you'll get a longer standard warranty as well. Now, you should know that the Civic will give you a little bit more legroom, and depending on the version you're talking about, a little bit more cargo room as well. But for some reason, there is no new hybrid version of the Civic. At the moment, the hybrid Civic is the Honda Insight, but on the Hyundai side, there is a Hyundai Elantra hybrid that gets really incredible fuel economy. There's also the N-Line trim, which is not quite a Civic Si, but will give you that turbocharged performance, actually better performance than we find in the Civic Turbo, with a dual clutch transmission, which is certainly more engaging to drive, for $24,100. So I would say that model is probably the better competitor to the EX trim in the Civic lineup. It's not really where the Touring model is, but it's actually going to give you better performance than either of those models. Next up, we have the ultimate grown-up option in the compact sedan segment, the Mazda 3. With their latest products, Mazda has really decided to target more premium shoppers. They want to be seen as the grown-up, more luxurious alternative in the segment, not necessarily the sporty alternative anymore, and that's why they're no longer using the tagline Zoom Zoom. This business choice is probably a good idea for Mazda because the Mazda 3 is one of the slower selling entries in this segment. They sell about 1/6 the number of Mazda 3s as Honda does Civics. And that's part of why pricing is a little bit more expensive. The base model starts at $20,650. That sounds like a good deal, but you get the smaller 2-liter engine in that model. Most of the other Mazda 3s are going to have bigger and more powerful engines. The next trim level up is $21,650. That gets you the 2.5-liter 4-cylinder engine in the Mazda lineup and more power than we find on average. 186 horsepower. It also has a regular automatic transmission, a 6-speed. Now, I have been a little bit hard on Mazda for using a 6-speed automatic transmission in some of their larger vehicles, but here in the compact segment, it's just fine, because the competition for this 6-speed is the sea of CVTs, or continuously variable transmissions, that we find in pretty much every other alternative. And I would certainly rather take a 6-speed auto over a CVT as far as driving enjoyment goes. You can also get a 2.5-liter turbocharged engine that produces 250 horsepower. You can get all-wheel drive, and you can get your Mazda 3 well over $30,000. So definitely more expensive than we find the Civic. Now, Mazda's latest vehicles have not exactly been class leaders when it comes to handling. Mazda has instead been focusing on making the vehicle look more premium, so I think that the Mazda 3 is by far the most attractive entry. It's gorgeous inside and outside, has a very distinctive design. But it does fall a little bit behind some of the competition when it comes to handling dynamics. The Civic is more fun to drive. The rear suspension is simply more settled than the Mazda 3. And I also think that a lot of the competition offers infotainment systems that are easier to use. Mazda has been really dedicated to their little controller dial in the center console. I find that system a little bit annoying to operate, to be perfectly honest. The systems that we find in the Hyundai Kia vehicles, the Honda vehicles, and honestly Toyota as well, is just more intuitive and easy to use. Because of the Mazda 3's design, it has a long hood profile and a little bit less interior room, so definitely keep that in mind. Bottom line, all of these vehicles are really solid options. As the segment has shrunk, it's coalesced around the Corolla, the Civic, the Hyundai Kia vehicles, the Sentra, and to a smaller extent, the Jetta and the Mazda 3. But it's easy to see where this segment is going long-term because 79% of this segment is done by just 3 companies, Toyota, Honda, and the Hyundai Kia conglomerate. Nissan trails things with 14% market share in this segment, and then everybody else is fighting for the scraps. I'm sure you've all heard that sedan sales are on a decline in the US, but in the compact sedan segment, things have actually been looking pretty good. As the number of entries has shrunk, total sales has actually continued to increase because I think the manufacturers that remain have done a really good job keeping their products fresh, and they've been releasing and redesigning products pretty rapidly. The Corolla, in the grand scheme of things, really isn't that old. We have a new Civic. The Elantra and Forte are pretty new, as is the Sentra. At this point in time, this segment really is dominated by Toyota, Honda, and the Hyundai Kia conglomerate. Those 3 manufacturers combined produce relatively similar numbers of compact sedans, and they account for nearly 80% of all compact sedan sales in the US. Nissan comes up at about 14%, and then everybody else is fighting for the remaining 6% of this particular market. Bottom lining these options at the moment is pretty easy for me. If you're looking for the ultimate compact appliance, and that could be good or bad depending on exactly what you're looking for, you want that vehicle to do exactly what it says on the label all the time, dependable, reliable, etc., high fuel economy, that would be the Toyota Corolla. If you're looking for the best value, that would unquestionably be the Sentra. It is quite inexpensive. If you're worried about Hyundai and Kia's newfound strength and their newfound, honestly, competitiveness in this segment, then take a look at the Civic. It also is the most grown-up option. I think that Honda retains a very slight edge in terms of interior design and in terms of handling ability versus the Korean options, but the Korean alternatives are definitely up and coming. And if you're willing to give up a tiny, tiny bit of polish and you like the styling of the new Elantra or the new Forte, they are going to be absolutely excellent options. And if you're looking for a lot of performance for very little cash, you should definitely be taking a look at their 1.6-liter turbo and their upcoming Elantra N. That is going to be an awful lot of fun for a very affordable price. You will be able to get the turbocharged engine in the Forte and in the Elantra with 201 horsepower for less than the mid-level turbo option in the Honda Civic. Actually, I should say the base turbo option, because the EX is where the turbo starts, and for about that price, you could get yourself a decent amount more power, more handling ability, and a much slicker 7-speed dual-clutch transmission. Let me know what you think about all that down there in the comments section below, and what would you get if you were shopping in this segment. Keep in mind that going from $20,000 to $30,000 is a pretty big leap for a lot of compact shoppers. That is a price increase of 50% from the bottom to the top of this relatively narrow segment. So definitely keep that in mind. Let me know what you would get down there in the comment section below. Find me over at facebook.com/AlexNautos, Instagram. Find merch over at awaymerch.com. You can get shirts right like this one, and I'll see all of you later.